To the webinar series on trauma-informed and healing-centered communities. And this is the first in our series that's going to provide an introduction to adverse experiences and trauma. My name is Amanda Rich, and I'm an associate professor of human services at York College of Pennsylvania, as well as the director of the Institute for Social Healing. And I thank you all for taking what I know is a busy afternoon embedded in a very busy week and a very busy time of year to spend this with us and learn together. So just as a heads up, this is in webinar format. If you have any questions or points that you'd like to bring up, please feel free to write them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And please note that you can write your questions either to any individual on the panel, myself, Julie Himler, or Craig Walt, or you can send them and have them be open to everyone. So please just be mindful, if you'd like to send it just to one of us more privately, make sure that you select that. This is also being recorded. However, when we get to the questions that will be addressed at the end of our presentation, we'll stop recording at that point. So welcome, and here we go. So before we get going, I would just like to give a special thanks and shout out to Pat Poet, who is the director of our institutional development and technology at York College of Pennsylvania. My co-presenters, Julie Himler, who's the Director of Community Education at the Victims Assistance Center at the YWCA York, Craig Walt, who is a Program Manager at Community Health and Program Manager at York City Bureau of Health. I'd also like to thank Rebecca Eyre, Karen Schwartz, and Dominic Della Caprini at the Center for Community Engagement, who all work together to help make not only the Institute possible, but also this webinar series. And lastly, I'd like to thank our partners and collaborators in various departments at York College, as well as our partnering universities at Lincoln University, Towson University, a number of the different local Penn State campuses, the University of Delaware, Millersville, and a number of others. So thank you so much. So our plan for the time together is one, I'm just going to spend just a few minutes introducing the Institute for Social Healing. This is a new project that we're developing, and I think it's useful to just explain what we hope for this project to become, what it is, and where we're going. I'm also going to talk about the larger webinar series on trauma-informed and healing-centered communities. We're then going to just kind of dig deep and provide some background information as to what exactly we mean by healing-centered and trauma-informed engagement, as well as what do we mean by this term of trauma that is so common right now in our everyday vernacular. Then Julie is going to talk about the nature of the research that's really the foundational building block as to how many of our practices and much of our knowledge base in relation to trauma and healing is built in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. They'll also talk about our stress response system, toxic stress, and sources of resilience at that individual and relationship level. Then we're going to turn it over to Craig, and he is going to be discussing adverse experiences at a community level and really a public health approach to understanding these experiences, as well as a public health approach to healing. Just as a quick heads up, although there's no graphic descriptions of abuse or violence in this presentation, there are going to be mentions of various types of traumatic events that can be hard for some people to hear. Some of those events do involve abuse and do involve violence, and so I recommend that folks listen with care. And should you find yourself or know someone who's in need of help, please reach out to some of the free and confidential resources that are available both locally in our area as well as nationally. So just as a quick introduction to the Institute for Social Healing, our mission is to use the resources of higher education to connect those who care about violence, trauma, and healing in our communities with the best possible information and with each other. This was made possible in part from a grant from the York Bar Foundation. And our hope for this is to create a collaborative of local researchers in the area who are interested in doing work that has meaning and value to folks who are doing studying violence and trauma and healing within our communities to help connect people with the best usable information possible. We believe that we can make even more change and really fulfill the mission of higher education, which is to be of service to our community by better coordinating and collaborating within our efforts. So our hope is to collect and be a source of a warehouse of information that's already out there, for us to be able to translate that information into things that are accessible and usable for folks who are interested in it, as well as be in conversation with members of the community to find out what are we lacking in regards to good information and how can we get it. This is designed to be a collaborative of faculty and staff and others who are involved in institutions of higher education to better partner and collaborate with folks in the community doing this work. We also hope to fulfill our mission of supporting a better informed, more compassionate citizenry, as well as a workforce, by creating better educational opportunities for our students to learn about trauma, as well as increase our ability to teach in a trauma-informed fashion. So social healing is a term that not everybody is familiar with, and it really arose out of the fields of theology as well as peace and conflict studies. And it works to reframe some of the challenges that we see in communities and in societies away from this idea of good versus bad, and towards an approach of hurt versus healing. And we can apply those concepts not just at a societal level, but also at a more micro level within ourselves and within our families and with our communities, moving away from seeing the struggles that we face from a dichotomy of deficit versus success, or failure versus success, and understand our experiences as deeply human and ones that connect us to each other. So I strongly suggest, if you haven't already, check out our new website. If you haven't signed up yet to be part of membership, it is free. I strongly recommend that folks do so. If you have in your possession some really wonderful resources that you think would be great to share related to trauma and healing, please do share it on that website. I'll make sure that it's posted. You can search by the nature of the topic or the nature of the resource itself. If you are a community member in need of information related to these topics, please feel free to reach out via the website as well, for us to hopefully connect you with people who might be able to provide connection to that information and to that research. So my job for this presentation is to just use a few minutes to give you some background information as to what exactly we mean by trauma. What is trauma-informed care or trauma-sensitive approaches, and what is healing and engagement? Is trauma something that you see, I think, a lot more than you have in the past online and in just everyday discussion. And we use that term very loosely, and sometimes it might leach away from the meaning just a little bit. It is also true that there's not necessarily a universal definition of trauma, but we're basing our definition off of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's understanding of trauma as an intersect and interplay between a person and their environment. So trauma is defined when one experiences an event that overwhelms our resources that we typically use to cope. Typically, we experience that event as terrifying, overwhelming, and scary, and one that makes us feel as though we are not in control of our environment. It's said to be trauma when that event and how we experience that event also leaves lasting effects in how we see ourselves, how we connect with ourselves, how we see ourselves in relation to the world, and how we connect with other people in those worlds, in that world. So we believe that an understanding as to what trauma is, the prevalence and nature of how the hurt that is incredibly common, if not universal, within our experience. Yes. How do we respond in a way that promotes healing? How do we respond in a way that results in sort of some internal reflection and looking inward at our system, the way our community is organized? So this idea of trauma-informed care really came into the nomenclature of clinical work in 2005, but an understanding that the scary big things that impact our life, that force us to rely heavily on our survival response systems, play a huge role in organizing how we move through the world. There's records of that across human history, and there's a lot of wisdom rooted in trauma and embodiment in many indigenous cultures, or artifacts from indigenous cultures and conversation in indigenous cultures, as well as across almost all of human history. We've developed a a greater lens and focus and emphasis on trauma really at the human service and community level, at least in our society in more recent decades. So trauma-informed care really evolved by looking and trying to figure out why was it that so many people who would benefit from the services that we have in the community for support don't. Why aren't they able to access those services? Why don't they stay in treatment? And in that process, there was a recognition that some of the services we provided had the possibility of not just not helping people, but also possibly hurting people. So a focus was developed in order to better understand how the hurt that people experience in their life, how an over-reliance on our stress response system can impact how people use the resources in their community. And the resources in those communities can be reorganized in a way that recognizes the widespread impact of trauma and the multiple paths towards healing and recovery. It involves everyone on board in the community, in the service systems, really recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma within themselves, within individuals they're working with, families, the staff, and the service systems that they've created or are part of. In doing so, the service system is designed to respond in a way that integrates that knowledge into a meaningful way, that shifts policies and practices in a direction that promotes healing, as well as understands the potential to add on to the hurt that already exists and resist that process, resist accidentally re-traumatizing people. So healing-centered engagement is a more latter extension of trauma-informed care that was termed by Sean Ginwright, who's a scholar and social worker, in 2018, and really developed out of his work with African-American youth activists. We found that how trauma-informed care was being applied was largely quite clinical. And a number of the folks that he was working with said, you know, we are not only the hurt that we've experienced, we're not only what happened to us, we are so much more. So the evolution and extension from from not a trauma-informed service system to a trauma-informed service system to a healing-centered approach represented a shift in questions that were asked, from what's wrong with you and how can we fix you, to what happened to you and how can we support you, latter to what is going right in your life and what does well-being look like from your definition and how can we all support you in getting there. When we look and when we hear Julie's discussion on ACEs and the prevalence of so many different types of harm and hurt that gets perpetuated in our community, we can recognize that the experience of trauma is not a purely individual experience. It is a collective and largely political, has many largely political drivers. And as such, when we think about healing, we need to move from an individualistic clinical approach to understanding healing as a collective and political approach. It also requires us really to look at the whole of our deep humanity, and that it is not that we don't just organize our lives around hurt. There's also room for joy and the experiences of joy that persists even in really difficult circumstances, and that joy that is not just inevitable is also a source of resistance and a source of resilience. So I'm going to end with just to nerd out just a little bit with a little bit of an understanding of traumatic stress and how it relates to the way that our brain has been organized. And the reason that I do that is not to bore people, though I don't think that it is boring, but instead what the research has shown is that when people have a deeper understanding of why we respond like we do to our world from a neurological and physiological level, when we understand what trauma is, we often are able to meet others and meet ourselves with a greater amount of compassion. And I just want to differentiate the term sympathy from compassion. So this information is not for people to feel bad for someone else, but instead compassion involves a recognition of that mindfulness and an awareness of what is happening within us, happening with the people who we're around, happening within our communities. And from that deeper awareness, we're able to meet that with a sense of shared humanity. That though we never know exactly what someone else is going through, we do know what it's like to hurt. Though we never understand how somebody experiences trauma in a specific way, we often understand the feelings that happen within us when we are faced with a scary and challenging situation. By recognizing that hurt and that suffering really as a bridge to one another, we're then able to become motivated and hopefully develop an awareness and a skill set in order to respond to ourselves and respond to others in our immediate environment, as well as those in our larger community, with a desire to ease that hurt. And at the very least, actions that don't perpetuate or pile on or add to that hurt. So for this really brief demonstration, if everybody who is able to can put out their hand and think of their heel of their hand right here as one of the early evolutionary layers as it relates to survival in the human system. So we can think of this heel of our hand as really the brainstem and cerebellum, which helps us stay alive from moment to moment, from second to second. So those are the things that helps us regulate digestion, monitor and regulate our body temperature, our breath, our heart rate, our balance system. And we know that when we are overwhelmed and stressed out, like I know many of you are, the first things that become dysregulated are our sleep, our digestion in our stomach, that feeling of tightness in our chest, maybe even a feeling of dizziness or disorientation. As we work our way up really to that center part of our hand, and if we tuck our thumb in right here, our thumb as well, we can think of that as our limbic system, or the mammalian section of our brain that we share with a lot of other social species. That part of our brain does a whole lot of things, but some of what it does is it helps us process new information, helps us form memories, and is the emotional center of our brain. So if you close your hand just around it like this, where the outer part of your fist is, we can think of that as the neocortex, or the human part of our brain. That part of our brain is responsible for our long-term survival, our sense of connection, our ability to accurately assess the intentions of other people, the ability to plan to use our resources over the long haul and collaborate and coordinate with other people in an intentional way that again allows for that sense of joy, well-being, connection, and general regulation. So we can often think of these multiple layers of our brain as analogous with a horse and a rider. So you can think of a horse as strong and powerful, reactive in many ways. And we can think of the rider as slower, possibly weaker, but more intentional and thoughtful in regards to the response. So when everything is going well, if you wiggle your thumb right in your hand, you can have that be sort of an analogy of having a feeling or having an emotion about some type of stimuli, some type of event or variable in your environment. And and usually under good circumstances, you have a feeling, but that rider, that neocortex comes in and says, okay, thank you for letting me know how we're feeling right now. I'm going to take that into consideration. We're going to proceed thoughtfully. But sometimes for folks who've experienced intense trauma or a really big emotion, for instance, and there's something in the environment that triggers something in our limbic system, in our amygdala, that reminds us of a highly threatening event, what happens is the rider gets thrown off and the horse runs away. And when we use that term, quote unquote, flipping our lid, or looking back on events like, gosh, I don't know why I responded like that. I don't know why I snapped like I snapped at my loved one, or I don't know why I just shut down in that particular moment. Often we can think of that moment as our rider getting thrown off, and using different tools and techniques, we can better help be able to regulate our horse, as well as get our rider to be a little stronger, so that we can work in a more coordinated fashion together. So I say this in part in regards to increasing that sense of compassion, because we generally don't respond to our behavior or the behavior of others directly. We respond to how we interpret that behavior. And I think a lot of us can understand now, working from home and having a child bust into the room screaming. Well, you might respond to that behavior and being a little annoyed if they are upset of something that their brother or sister did. However, you're going to respond in a very different way if they busted into that room screaming because they're really hurt, or there's a fire in the kitchen. So by better understanding what happens within us when it comes to those really hard moments that I think many of us can relate to right now in the course of this pandemic, we can meet ourselves with a little bit more compassion. We can meet others with more compassion. And we can hopefully take this knowledge and bring it to scale in ways that our service systems and our community as a whole responds with more kindness, more connection, and more compassion. So with that, I'm going to turn the show over to Julie Himler to discuss the adverse childhood experience study and the research that that really drives a lot of our work in trauma-informed care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and join in on this conversation around trauma and ACEs, and really just embarking on this discussion around how can we expand our approach to addressing trauma beyond trauma-informed care and toward healing-centered engagement, healing-centered communities. And in order for us to move towards healing-centered engagement, it's important that we have a better understanding of trauma and the impact that trauma has on individuals and whole communities. And much of our understanding of trauma is rooted in actually the war experiences of our Vietnam veterans, many of whom came back from war, suffering from prolonged flashbacks, nightmares, frightening or intrusive thoughts, right? The sweats or racing hearts. And as we began to study our veterans, we came to recognize that much of what they were experiencing was connected to trauma. And eventually we were able to kind of define that as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And over the past 30 years, that comprehension has really expanded to civilians who endured traumatic experiences such as rape or child abuse and neglect. And in the mid-1990s, a now very famous HMO, Kaiser Permanente, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, conducted one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household dysfunction, and how they relate to high-risk health behaviors and later life health and well-being. So basically negative health impacts. And the name of the study was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACE study. And the original study was conducted from 1995 to 1997. And over 17,000 volunteer patients from Southern California receiving physical exams completed confidential surveys regarding their adverse childhood experiences and their current health status. And what's notable is that the participants were primarily white, middle to upper class, college educated, they all had jobs, and they all had higher end medical insurance. The participants were asked about 3 categories that were classified as childhood adverse experiences. And those 3 categories were childhood abuse, childhood neglect, and household dysfunction. And abuse included physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Neglect included physical and emotional neglect. And then household dysfunction included household mental illness, which could include somebody who might be suicidal or even experience severe forms of depression, an incarcerated relative in the household, a mother treated violently, or witnessing domestic violence in the home, and then any substance abuse, and then parental separation or divorce. And the ACE findings produced 2 areas of unexpected results for the researchers. And the first was the prevalence of ACEs in a relatively well-off population. And then the second area was the strength of the relationship between ACEs and negative health outcomes. So more than a quarter of subjects grew up in a household with alcohol or drug abuse, as you can see from this slide. And then, over 20% had been sexually abused as children. And of those who were sexually abused, 28% were actually women. As a matter of fact, there was a greater number of women reporting ACEs across all categories, with the exception of physical abuse, than men. And then, as you can see, 28% had experienced severe physical abuse. And as we can see, ACEs are common. So the study also found that ACEs often occur together almost 2/3 of study participants reported at least one ACE, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs. And the ACE study also found that ACEs often occur together. So almost 2/3 of study participants reported at least one ACE, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs, as I said before. But also, it's important to keep in mind that the original ACE study examined middle to upper middle class subjects. And we also know that some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing ACEs because of social and economic conditions. And that's something that we're going to talk a little bit more about later, but it is something to keep in mind that although these questions were very specific to certain adverse experiences, we absolutely know that there are other things that were impacting the outcomes of the ACEs. And as research followed participants over time, they discovered that a person's cumulative ACE score has a strong graded relationship to numerous health, social, and behavioral problems throughout their lifespan, including chronic disease, mental illness, violence, and being a victim of violence too, which means basically that the higher the ACE score, the higher risk for negative health outcomes. And they also found that many problems related to ACEs tend to be comorbid or co-occurring. So some of the high-risk health behaviors included smoking, alcohol and drug abuse, severe obesity. And research has demonstrated that when children are exposed to chronic stressful events, their neurodevelopment is disrupted. And Amanda touched on that a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But as a result, the child's cognitive functioning or ability to cope with negative or disruptive emotions might be impaired. And over time, and often during adolescence, the child may adopt negative coping mechanisms such as substance abuse or self-harm. And eventually these unhealthy coping mechanisms can contribute to disease, disability, and social problems, as well as premature mortality. So for example, people with an ACE score of 4 are twice as likely to be smokers and 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic. And having an ACE score of 4 increases the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis by nearly 400%, and attempted suicide by 1,200%. And people with an ACE score of 6 or more are actually higher at risk of their lifespan being shortened by 20 years. Let's face it, we all know that, that stress in life is normal, right? And it's even necessary to develop healthy coping mechanisms and problem-solving skills. But in the absence of protective factors, toxic stress damages children's developing minds. So stress is the body's normal response to challenging events or environments. And when we look at positive stress increases heart rate and the amount of stress hormones in the body. And the response is brief and it's mild to moderate. And when a caring and responsive adult helps a child to cope with the stressor, that adult serves as a protective factor, right? Which helps return the stress response system back to its baseline. And that can be done in a relatively short period of time. So this kind of response to mildly adverse circumstances is an opportunity, right, for growth, because it enables the child to discover some of their inner strengths, some of their own resilience, and really knowing that they can overcome challenges. For instance, if a child falls down on the ground on the ground and is supported by an adult picking that child back up, right? That child learns that they can bounce back from that because they've got that support, they've got that protective factor in that adult. So the key to positive stress is the support through the availability of a caring and responsive adult who helps the child cope with the stressor. So when we look at tolerable stress, it's associated with experiences of greater adversity or even threats. So for instance, the death of a loved one, or even a serious illness or injury, a contentious divorce, even a natural disaster could be a tolerable stressor, right? There's a risk that these types of experiences will produce excessive activation of the stress response system that could lead to long-term negative health outcomes. But again, the presence of a protective factor, a supportive and protective adult, has the ability to foster and facilitate the child's adaptive coping and sense of control and reduce the child's, stress response, and it basically enables the child's body to return again back to that normal baseline. So when we look at toxic stress, we know that that can result from strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress response system, like we see with ACEs, right? When there's no buffering protection of a supportive adult relationship. And this is where we often see the individuals with high ACE scores, especially when the absence or neglect of parents occur over extended periods of time and repetition. For example, caregivers who are struggling with addiction or substance use or mental health struggles, or even the absence of a parent due to incarceration. They're less able to provide that support to their children. And pediatrician Nadine Burke-Harris beautifully describes the brain and body's response system when children are exposed to high doses of adversity in her TED Med talk on ACEs. And I highly recommend watching it. I'm gonna read a little excerpt from it because even reading it, I'm not gonna do as good a job for anybody who's ever seen it, but I really like the way that it illustrates it. So Dr. Burke-Harris asks us to imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from that bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is, what happens when the bear comes home every night? And this system is activated over and over and over again. And basically it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. And children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. So high doses of adversity not only affect the brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. And I always, even just reading that, it's so interesting how it just really sends a message to me of what that must feel like on an ongoing basis. And that's something that I try to remember when I'm thinking about what is happening to somebody who's experienced this amount of toxic stress. So these adverse childhood experiences are disrupting a child's neurodevelopment, and over time, and often during adolescence when their brains are still developing. And the child may adopt negative coping mechanisms or health risk behaviors such as substance use, smoking, even self-harm. And eventually these unhealthy coping mechanisms can contribute to the disease and disability and social problems, as well as premature mortality. And that's what this slide with the pyramid really shows the development of those adverse childhood experiences, how they disrupt neurodevelopment, lead to those health risk behaviors that then lead to the disease and disability and potentially early death. Which sounds really depressing. It sounds really depressing. It feels very, it can leave us feeling helpless, and it can leave us feeling hopeless. But understanding the strong correlation is, you know, of that adversity to these negative health outcomes, it's only one part of the equation. So no child is magically resilient or invulnerable to ACEs, just as no child is automatically doomed in the face of ACEs. The presence of protective factors, which I've mentioned numerous times, and particularly safe, stable, and nurturing relationships can often mitigate the consequences of those ACEs. Protective factors are what help children feel safe, right? And able to know that they can overcome some of this toxic stress in their life. And it kind of helps to neutralize all of those physical changes that naturally occur during times of stress. And individuals, families, and communities can also be an influence on the development of many protective factors throughout a child's life that can impact their development. So some examples of protective factors are social emotional competence of children. So we know children's early experiences of being nurtured and developing a positive relationship with caring adults affects all aspects of behavior and development. And when we look at concrete support in times of need, families who can meet their own basic needs for food, clothing, housing, and transportation, and who know the resources to be able to obtain those things fare much better and are much more resilient. Support of social connections. So parents with a social network, right, of emotionally supportive friends. When you have somebody that you can go to and rely on and share some of the stressors in your life, the stressors that you have with your own children, that in and of itself is also a protective factor. And then knowledge of parenting and child development. So children thrive when parents provide not only affection, but also respectful communication and listening and consistency, right, in rules and expectations and safe opportunities that are going to promote independence. And these are just some of the protective factors. There are many, many more out there that really can serve to build that resilience within anybody who's experienced stress and or trauma. And these protective factors can also include a person's own biological and developmental characteristics. And these are things that sometimes we can't put our finger on, right? They're just inherent to that child. And also the characteristics of the family and the community. And that is something that Craig is going to talk about. And these protective factors are also what help explain how some people who have sustained a great deal of adversity as children are able to heal and even to thrive. And trauma-informed care has become an important approach when serving young people who have been exposed to trauma, because it encourages support and treatment to the whole person. And it's really the shift in asking, as Amanda had said earlier, what's wrong with you to what happened to you? And that has really opened up how we approach addressing trauma. But one of the things that it fails to look at is the fact that people are so much more than their trauma. They're not defined by their trauma. There's, as I had talked about earlier, you know, we recognize that things like poverty influence somebody's ability to, you know, it is a form of an adverse childhood experience. And that's why in subsequent ACE surveys, they've actually included other questions that are, you know, are like on racism, excuse me, on violence outside of the home, in violent and living in communities of violence, of growing up in the foster care system. There's so many other things that are now being addressed. And this is what I'm going to hand it over to Craig, because he can talk so much more about that. But I didn't want to end on too much of a negative note, because I know the ACE study can feel very, very heavy. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, Craig, and I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. Hope everyone can hear me. If not, I'm sure Amanda can let me know. But before I share my screen and pull a few slides up, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction first. But similarly, I'm really grateful to be a part of this discussion. I've been with the City Health Bureau for a little over 6 years, focusing on a variety of community health programs, including our Safe and Healthy Communities program, which focuses on healthy food access, access to opportunities for physical activity. So that means safe parks and safe streets for you to walk to school or recreate in the evenings. Also doing some work focused on substance abuse prevention, other programs focused on lead and healthy housing initiatives. So I'm really excited through our Safe and Healthy Communities program that now there's going to be a little more of a focus on a comprehensive approach to community stress and trauma. And I think some of our programs have been, addressing pieces of these issues. But I'm really excited for the Bureau to be a part of this conversation, because I think one of our overall takeaways from this webinar is that you'll see it really does need a comprehensive approach all the way from the individual level to the community level. So really my goal today is to introduce some ways to view stress, trauma, and ACEs from a community perspective. Thank you very much, Julie, for really clearly connecting the impact of ACEs on a variety of health outcomes and overall well-being. I think it's really clear that those connections are there, and there's plenty of evidence to substantiate that. And so what I'm going to do is focus more on introducing a public health approach to ACEs. So to do that, some of the concepts that I'm going to share are, much of it's actually pulled from a framework that I've referenced over the years that refers to ACEs as adverse community experiences. So maybe we can actually throw this toolkit in our list of resources after the end of this webinar, so you all can dig in a little bit more to that. But from that framework, I'm going to share some community level risk factors, as well as some strategies to address those issues, which tend to be, socio-cultural, related to the economic and educational conditions in a community, and really even the built environment, and how the conditions where we, live, work, learn, and play really are strong contributors to what our daily lived experience looks like. And then you'll see, how that connects to, the potential higher likelihood of experiencing ACEs on really a regular basis, which again, Julie had really laid out how much of an impact that does have. And then I'm going to try to leave off with kind of an overview of some actionable strategies and examples of community resilience. So as I've spent time, researching and learning about ACEs, the one thing I think is great is that over the last decade or more, there's been a lot more focus from the medical community on trauma and trauma-informed care. But I think it's important to also kind of understand that really is a piece of the puzzle, as the medical model tends to focus on almost a screening and treatment approach. So if we can assess somebody's level of risk or the amount of ACEs that they've experienced, we can then refer them to resources that are well suited to meet those needs. I think what differentiates a public health approach is that it's much more focused on primary and secondary prevention. So really trying to use community level strategies to prevent ACEs from occurring in the first place. But we know that that's not possible. That's the pie in the sky vision. And also, as it's been pointed out, great things can come from adversity and the strength and perseverance, through all of that. But also the need to have those protective factors in place to reduce the impact of ACEs when they do occur. So, what I'm ultimately saying is trauma really isn't just limited to the individual or family unit. It's really visible at a community level. And even if you were to take a data-driven approach to this and started mapping out everyone's individual ACE scores, you would start to see certain neighborhoods or certain communities that are just experiencing higher levels of ACEs, huge disparities between, those communities and others. So, again, I think that kind of underscores how, trauma-informed care is an important piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't necessarily address those community-level issues that people are facing on a daily basis. And that's where I really like using the adverse community experiences framework, because I even think replacing the terminology adverse childhood experiences with adverse community experiences, I think it just starts to open up your eye that these aren't just case by case issues, or, as I said, limited to the individual or the household. These things are really pervasive at a community level. And then to also realize that there's often a lot of historic systemic issues that have allowed those environments to develop and perpetuate. So what I want to do now is pull up a few pictures. And if this was a smaller group, I think I would be really interested in hearing about what these pictures, what feelings are elicited. But since we have a larger group, that's not really possible. So these first couple, I just want you to take these pictures in. These are from York City. And if you can't read that sign, that says Girard Park, which is one of our York City parks. And so again, since we can't ask everybody to chime in right now, I just want you to take a moment and picture if this was what you saw on your walk to school every morning. Things like that. This is what should be a park. This is housing on one of our main thoroughfares. So now I want to move towards some other photos that I think it's sad that we have to come together as a community so strongly against something such as community violence. But at the same time, my point in sharing these photos is to start showing the importance of creating those safe spaces at a community level, for people to come together to heal. Briefly before we started the webinar, I was commenting on this photo with Julie and Amanda and just sharing how I think, it's great to see the community coming together, but really sad that, any child would actually have to come to an event in their backyard and hold up those signs. So now I want to move towards some other pictures. Again, these are all from York City. These are from Penn Park. The picture on the left is the Broad Street Greenway, which connects Good Elementary School and Hannah Penn K through 8. The picture on the right is by Lincoln Charter School out in the Salem Square neighborhood. This is at York Fresh Food Farms, located behind the Parkway, behind Parkway Housing on the northern side of the city. And this is a picture from Lincoln Charter's Bike to City Hall event that they hold every year. And so those last few pictures I shared, I think are really going to drive at the point that we're trying to make. And the point that I'm trying to make, that you can't always just try to treat ACEs after they occur, that you need to create safe, healthy, and resilient communities. And when they do occur, these kinds of protective factors and these positive things in the community have profound impacts on childhood development, on their feelings of safety and connectedness with their community, and their overall development. So I think this really kind of encompasses a lot of the things in the adverse community experiences framework, and really helps us start to look at community level risk factors, as well as strategies at a community level. Oh, I'm sorry, here was another photo, Salem Square Library, and then story time happening inside. So being the public health person that I am, I can't help but just kind of try to bring this together using the concept of the social determinants of health. But as I said earlier, it's really realizing that it's the conditions where we live, work, and play that are ultimately influencing our health outcomes. And so when you start to look at these factors listed here, they really relate to what we're talking about. Hunger and food security, housing security, even access to safe transportation, as I was talking about, safe routes to school, our educational environments, the economic environment, what kind of workforce develop opportunities are available, and even just the overall, the sociocultural environment. I think it's really interesting, and what helps me put it into context during the current times is that, think about this year, and even the, it's almost a double whammy between COVID and the need to isolate and socially distance ourselves from other, and think about the toll that has taken on us. And then also even think about the political environment this year and how much animosity we've seen from all directions, and how that impacts how connected we feel to our neighbors. Potentially, depending on what sign they have out in front of their place, that affects how you interact with each other. And again, I think that starts to just, drive home the point I'm trying to make, that there's so many factors at a community level that affect how we feel connected to ourselves, how comfortable we feel as we're, walking to school or on our daily errands to go, to go to the grocery store, or to, get home from work to put food on the table. And those daily experiences, as Julie has explained, really can have a compounding effect if there isn't, those protective factors available. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. But again, I think this is just another model of framing some of these community level issues. I did bring up, the sociocultural environment, and I think, as we've said, there's systemic issues that are, contributing to, the community environment. These issues can be a result of racism throughout history, and the disadvantage, the disadvantage that has caused communities of color. I think a prime example of this is such a big focus on police brutality this year, and, targeting communities of color. I think we've seen that the communities that actually took the time to create the safe space, that healing space, communities that listened, experienced a sense of community healing that really can't be described, I think, other than by those who really participated in that genuinely and authentically. And I think, in the communities that did not listen and fought against acknowledging those harsh realities, and the collective experience of communities of color, they ended up worsening the climate and frustrated and hurt communities that really needed that safe space. And again, I think the level of, our political discourse in the country, I think is a whole other, adds a whole other layer to that. Nonetheless, though, I do believe that humans are resilient social beings, and we, in the face of adversity, find ways to connect and persevere together. Another section here for place is what I was referring to with the built environment, those housing conditions and blight. Transportation, is there equitable access to jobs and services and amenities? Are the parks safe? Are there safe streets and other public spaces? Access to, to healthy food? All of those things contribute to what our daily lived experience looks like. And then again, the economic environment and educational environment. Is there workforce development initiatives, access to fair paying jobs, educational opportunities that lay the foundation for economic success? I can't help but consider, what we've seen in New York City throughout history, and the disinvestment that we've seen, decades ago, and we continue to struggle to, come back from that. This, led to all kinds of things like, disproportionate tax burdens on the poorest populations in the county, really low property values, and then even an opportunity that, or an environment that's not business friendly to attract those businesses and jobs that we need, so that we can have better access to walkable jobs and disrupt those, generational cycles of poverty. As I'm talking about these community level issues, it can seem like really, really heavy to try to move these things in the right direction. But we know there's a lot of effort already in our community trying to address these issues. I would say that some of those efforts are still taking place in silos. But ultimately, we're all trying to drive towards the same goal. And I do believe we can come together and collaborate to do that more successfully. So now I'd kind of like to leave off, also trying to be mindful for time, since I know we have the Q&A section, but I wanted to leave off with some strategies, some community healing related strategies, kind of answering the question, what makes a safe, healthy, and resilient community? And using those healing-centered, community strategies helps us start to answer these questions and work together towards that vision. I think of, one example of a mentorship program that supports youth, especially those most at risk. The impacts of these programs are really profound, but I think they're often overlooked and or taken for granted. So I think of like the YWCA Temple Guard program as an example of this. The impact that has on the kids that participate is so much more than, seeing the events that they put on at public events, or the fact that they have practice to go to after the school and it gives the parents a break. That kind of a grassroots mentorship program, I think is key to creating or to having those protective factors available to community members. I also think that as we look at communities, different community-based initiatives, we can't just rely on people who are struggling to volunteer their time. I think sometimes it's easy to say, like, why can't you just show up for your community? Or why didn't you come to the community meeting to voice your concerns? When people are in survival mode financially and emotionally, and trying to make ends meet on a daily basis, it's really hard for them to show up for the community, let alone their household. So I think we all need to keep this in mind when, we question why some of our community-based efforts aren't getting the buy-in from community members, because ultimately we need to meet people where they're at. Another great healing strategy is strengthening intergenerational relationships. So these kinds of programs can help individuals from age 8 to 80 feel like they have a strong purpose in their community. I've already mentioned the need to improve the conditions where people live. So the built environment with parks, housing, and transportation. Those safe routes to school programs, having worked on those a lot through our Safe and Healthy Communities initiative, it's often really hard to sell those programs to funders because they may not think that they actually have a huge impact. Okay, so kids are getting more physical activity on the walk to school. But actually, it's trying to create that healthy, safe experience, as they walk to school. I would also like to stress the importance of collaboration. Like I had said earlier, I feel like there's a lot of effort in our community, but as with any community, we struggle to break the silos. But I think this isn't just among organizations. I think we really need to strongly engage the people that we're trying to help and have shared decision making and really think about reworking the power structure so that we can advance community level strategies that rebuild social networks and trust. And I think one of the last strategies that I want to highlight is what I would put as changing the narrative around a community. So again, being focused on York City, I'll use the example that in the York area, the negative commentary around York City is detrimental. Kids live, learn, and play here, and they need to be proud of who they are, where they come from, in order to thrive. They don't deserve to be labeled as less than or any other assumption or stereotype that tends to get thrown in the direction of urban youth. And I think that, again, is something that we really need to be mindful of and see as an important strategy to healing our community. So really some takeaways is that prevention is a prevention-focused approach is the public health approach. And this is focused on reducing ACEs as well as mitigating the impact of ACEs when they occur. The need for collaborative community-based approaches, and that this is more than treating ACEs. This is about creating safe, healthy, resilient communities, in the face of adversity. So I think we only have a few more minutes left here. So I'm going to turn things back over to Amanda and stop sharing my screen here.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your insight and your experiences and all of the information that you relayed so beautifully here.